Adam Bandt, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks very much.
Now, how does killing off the Affordable Housing Future Fund help anyone who's struggling to find a house to rent or buy?
Well, Labor's got no plan for renters, and the legislation that it's putting before the Parliament at the moment takes $10 billion of public money, gambles it on the stock market. If there happens to be a return in any given year, then they'll spend that money on public housing. Last year, the fund made a loss. And even in the best case scenario, they won't build any properties under this until after the next election. And at the end of the plan, the public and affordable and social housing waiting list will be longer than it is now.
Let's just go to some of those points you've just made. First of all, in relation to the returns, yes, last year was a bad year for the Future Fund, but over a decade it returned 9.1% per annum. So that's the kind of return that they would be hoping for, and it's not quite right to pick just 1 year out of a cycle, is it?
Well, the government's own advisory body, investment body, has said that to tackle the scale of the crisis that we've got at the moment, you'd need to be spending about $15 billion a year on housing. Now, the government is talking about spending a maximum of $500 million and potentially none. Now, that is not a policy that addresses the scale of the crisis, and the government is saying this is their response to the rental crisis that the country is facing.
Let's just pick up on one more thing that you said there. You called it a gamble, but isn't that like saying the super funds on whom so many of our retirements are based are nothing but a gamble? It's the same system that we're talking about, that we all rely on.
We've got a crisis now, and
but hang on, that was a question about the gamble. You referred to the returns on investments as a gamble. That's the same system we use for superannuation, right?
Very happy to respond to it if I get a chance. Rents are rising 6 times faster than wages. People are hurting now. Now, we need answers now to address the crisis. And in terms of investment, the Greens want the government to get back to doing what governments used to do, which is just directly invest in building public housing. Now, the plan that we've put on the table today, because the government is seeking our support, we've said, well, look, why not spend $5 billion out of that $15 billion that your own body has said you need to spend on housing? Spend $5 billion as a Commonwealth contribution, together with co-contributions from the state, and start actually building public housing. Right? Don't put it in an investment fund, hope it makes some money, and then spend the interest on it. Just build public housing. That is part of the reason that we're in this rental crisis at the moment, is that governments have taken their foot off the accelerator, stopped building public housing, and now we're seeing a massive rental crisis. So we've said 3 things today: spend money on investing in public housing and just build it, let's government do it like used to do. Double rent assistance, and ensure that across the country there is going to be a rent freeze.
All right, let's go to
states a financial incentive to freeze rents like we did during the pandemic.
We'll come back to that in a moment, but just to stay with this idea, because the government has got some legislation on the table. Another option for you and the Greens, instead of blocking it, would have been to join Senator David Pocock to improve it. So why not work to improve the legislation before you that can get underway quickly rather than kill it?
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And we're saying to the government that at the moment, if the government comes to the table, takes the scale of the rental crisis seriously, puts the issue of a rent freeze on the National Cabinet agenda, works with the states to freeze rents and deliver real relief, which is something, of course, that happened during the pandemic.
In exceptional circumstances.
Well, but we're in exceptional circumstances now, where in Melbourne, people are sleeping in tents. I've got pregnant women who are couch surfing because you've got food bank queues are growing. People are spending 60% of their income on rents. It's becoming very hard to find a place to rent near where you work or study. I mean, a lot of people have given up on the hope of ever owning their own home or their kids of owning their own home. And now even renting is being put out of reach for people. This is a crisis that needs action now, and I just think Labor doesn't get it.
Well, let's talk about what your fellow Senate crossbenchers think, because they don't understand what you're doing here by blocking this or by putting a rent freeze on the table that you know is not going to be accepted. Let me just quote Jackie Lambie. She says, stopping this bill and holding it up for months makes her feel, quote, sick to the guts. Are you listening to the Senate crossbenchers that you could be working with?
Look, we are working with everyone across the parliament, but can I just pick up on one issue that you raised there? A rent freeze can happen. It happened during the pandemic.
Yes, just
now,
come, if you would, Mr. Bandt, I'd like just come back to what your fellow crossbenchers are saying, because this is the legislation that's before the Senate now, and your fellow crossbenchers are saying they don't understand what it is the Greens are doing by blocking it. As Jackie Lambie said, sick to the gut. So the question is, are you listening to your fellow crossbenchers?
Look, I've got a lot of time for Senator Lambie, but of course Senator Lambie voted to give $9,000 a year tax cuts to the likes of Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart with the stage 3 tax cuts. We're going to put forward our own economic alternative, and I noticed that Senator Pocock has called also for an increase in funding. There are, across the board, you hear other housing groups, you hear unions, industry groups all saying we need a lot more to tackle the scale of the crisis that we are facing.
Would you be open to a deal on this particular legislation if the government brought forward more money, as David Pocock is suggesting?
Well, that's what the Greens are suggesting, and that's what I've suggested today. We are up for negotiating over this legislation, as we did over the safeguard legislation, but the government has to take the rental crisis seriously and has to understand that it is time for a substantial investment to rebuild public housing that has just not been built over years and is a big part of the reason that we're in the crisis that we are at the moment. So take the rental crisis seriously, start putting... At the moment, the legislation does not guarantee a single dollar goes to build any new units. Start investing directly like governments used to do, and that is exactly what we are asking for our support to pass the legislation.
Let's just understand the politics of this. You're opposing a concrete policy that delivers affordable housing while arguing that if more people vote for you in an election in 2025, you'll be able to force the government to deliver housing then. How do you explain to voters that you stopped them getting houses when they needed them?
Well, we are in a housing and rental crisis right now, and people are in pain right now. And the government is coming along and saying that their sole housing plan won't take effect until after the next election and has nothing in it for renters. We are in a rental and housing crisis, and the government does not seem to get it. And when we put on the table during question time ideas like a rent freeze, like we had during the pandemic, the Prime Minister just throws his hands up and calls it pixie dust. Now, Labor is in power federally. There is wall-to-wall Labor on the mainland. Labor can no longer wash its hands of the rental and housing crisis. I don't think people think that this federal government caused the housing crisis, but they do want governments to now start to intervene, to do more to fix the housing crisis, and by freezing rent increases, by building more public housing, by doubling Commonwealth rent assistance, the government can make a real difference. As it stands at the moment, the government has said their sole plan to deal with the housing crisis has nothing for renters. That's not good enough. Our job is to push the government like we pushed them to act on coal and gas during the safeguard negotiations. Now we are pushing them to act on renters.
Adam Bandt, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thanks very much.